The letter arrived at dawn, and by the time the sun had fully risen, Margaret's father was pale as ash, sitting at the breakfast table with his hands shaking around a cup of cold tea. She did not need to ask what was written on the page. She could see it, in the way her mother gripped the back of a chair, knuckles white, eyes fixed on nothing. "We have 3 days," her father finally said, his voice hollow. 3 days before the Duke's men come to take the house. Margaret stood in the doorway, still in her morning dress, her hair not yet pinned. The words did not frighten her the way they frightened her parents. She had known this day was coming for months, ever since her father's debts had grown too large to hide, ever since the harvest had failed for the 2nd year running, ever since the name Ashcombe had become a word spoken only in whispers in their household, as if saying it too loudly might summon ruin faster. "Then we must go to him," Margaret said. "We must ask for more time." Her father laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "You think the Duke of Ashcombe grants mercy? He is a man of ledgers and numbers, Margaret. He does not know the meaning of mercy." "Then someone must teach him," she said, and even as the words left her mouth, she felt a flicker of fear at her own boldness. Her mother turned to her sharply. "Margaret, this is not a matter for a young woman to involve herself in. Your father will write to him. We will find another way." "There is no other way," Margaret said quietly. "We have tried every way. The bank will not lend to us. Uncle Frederick has already turned us away. The only door left unopened is the Duke's, and someone must knock on it before the 3 days are gone." Her father shook his head, but she could see in his eyes that he had no better plan. He was a proud man, and pride had kept him from writing that letter, from making that visit, from admitting defeat to the most powerful landowner in the county. But pride would not save their home. It would not save the roof over her younger brothers' heads, nor the small garden her mother had tended for 20 years, nor the portraits of grandparents long buried that hung in the hallway. "I will go," Margaret said. "I will go to Ashcombe Hall myself." The carriage ride took most of the morning. Margaret sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the countryside change from the modest, well-worn fields of her family's land to the vast, manicured grounds of the Ashcombe estate. Everything here spoke of wealth beyond anything she had known. The hedges were trimmed with precision. The gravel drive stretched endlessly toward a house so large it seemed to swallow the horizon. She had heard stories about the Duke, of course. Everyone in the county had. Julian, Duke of Ashcombe, was said to be a man without warmth, a man who had inherited his title young and had spent the years since building a reputation for coldness that matched the marble halls of his home. Some said he had once been different, before the deaths of his parents had left him alone with a fortune and a name to protect. Others said he had always been this way, that kindness had simply never been part of his nature. Margaret did not know which version was true, and as the carriage rolled to a stop before the towering entrance of Ashcombe Hall, she realized she was about to find out. A butler met her at the door, his expression unreadable as he took her name and disappeared to announce her arrival. Margaret stood in the entrance hall, feeling smaller with every passing second. The ceilings rose high above her, painted with scenes she did not recognize. A staircase curved upward like something from a painting. She had worn her best dress that morning, but standing here, surrounded by such grandeur, she felt every patch and every worn seam as though it were shouting her family's poverty to the world. "The Duke will see you now," the butler said, returning at last, and Margaret followed him down a long corridor, her heart beating faster with every step. The study door opened, and there he was. Julian, Duke of Ashcombe, stood by the window with his back to her, looking out over the grounds. He did not turn immediately, and Margaret took the moment to study him. He was younger than she had expected, though something in his posture, in the stillness of his shoulders, suggested a man carrying far more weight than his years should allow. When he finally turned, his eyes met hers, and she saw nothing there. No curiosity, no warmth, nothing but the flat, assessing gaze of a man used to being approached by people who wanted something from him. "You are the daughter," he said. It was not a question. "Margaret," she replied, refusing to let her voice shake. "Margaret Ellison, my father sent word that you require payment within 3 days. I have come to ask for more time." "I did not summon your father to send you in his place." "No," she agreed. "He did not send me. I came because I chose to." Something flickered across his face then, gone so quickly she almost missed it. He gestured toward a chair, and she sat, spine straight, hands folded, refusing to let herself tremble in front of this man who held her family's future in his hands. "3 days is more time than I have given other debtors," Julian said, moving to sit behind his desk. "Your father has had 2 years to settle this debt. I have been more than patient." "You have been patient with a ledger," Margaret said. "Not with a family," My father is proud, and pride has cost us dearly, but my mother did not ruin the harvest, and my brothers did not choose to be born into a house with debts hanging over their heads. If you take our home, you take it from people who had no part in creating this debt." Julian's eyes narrowed slightly, studying her with new interest. Most people who sat in that chair wept, or begged, or offered excuses. This woman offered him an argument, delivered without a single tear. "You are bold for someone in your position," he said. "I have nothing left to lose by being bold," Margaret answered. "Everything else has already been taken from consideration. I have no dowry worth mentioning, no connections that could help you, nothing to offer but the truth of our situation, so I will speak plainly. Give us more time, and we will find a way to repay you. Take our home now, and you will gain nothing but an empty house and a family cast into the street." Silence stretched between them. Julian rose from his desk and walked to the window again, his hands clasped behind his back. Margaret watched him, unsure whether she had made things better or worse, unsure whether her honesty would be met with mercy or dismissal. "Your father's debt is significant," Julian said finally. "More time will not change the fact that he lacks the means to pay it. Extending the deadline only delays the inevitable." "Then let it be delayed," Margaret said. "A delay is still more than we have now." He turned to face her again, and this time something in his expression had shifted, though she could not name what it was. Curiosity, perhaps, or the faint stirring of a man unused to being challenged, finding that he did not entirely dislike it. "I will consider your request," he said. "Return tomorrow and I will give you my answer." It was not the answer she had hoped for, but it was not the refusal she had feared either. Margaret rose, thanked him with as much composure as she could manage, and allowed the butler to lead her back through the grand corridors and out into the afternoon light. Her hands trembled now that she was no longer under his gaze, and she pressed them together to steady herself as she climbed back into the carriage. She did not know it yet, but the Duke of Ashcombe had not stopped thinking of her the moment she left his study. He stood at the window long after her carriage had disappeared down the drive, turning over her words in his mind, surprised by how thoroughly a stranger had managed to unsettle the careful order of his thoughts. That evening, Margaret told her parents only that the Duke had asked her to return the following day. She did not tell them of the strange, unsettled feeling that had followed her home, the sense that something had shifted in that study, though she could not say what. Her father took the news as a small mercy and allowed himself, for the first time in weeks, a moment of cautious hope. Margaret lay awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling of her small bedroom, thinking of cold gray eyes that had, just once, seemed to soften. She told herself it meant nothing. Men like the Duke of Ashcombe did not change their minds because of a single conversation. And yet she could not shake the feeling that tomorrow would bring something she had not expected, something far beyond a simple extension of time. Downstairs, her two younger brothers, Peter and Simon, had already gone to bed without understanding the full weight of what loomed over the household. They were young enough that the idea of losing their home seemed like a story rather than a possibility, and Margaret had done her best to keep it that way, laughing with them at supper, pretending her mind was not consumed with numbers and deadlines. Only when she had kissed their foreheads and closed their door had she allowed her own composure to slip, just for a moment, in the quiet of the hallway. Her mother found her there, sitting on the top stair with her face in her hands. "You should not carry this alone," her mother said, sitting beside her. "Someone must," Margaret answered. "Father cannot go to him. His pride will not allow it. And even if it did, I do not think the Duke would listen to another man's excuses. He listened to me today. I do not know why, but he did." Her mother studied her carefully, the way mothers do when they sense something has shifted in their daughters that words have not yet caught up to. "What is he like, this Duke everyone fears?" Margaret considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Colder than I expected, but not entirely without reason beneath the coldness. I think he is a man who has learned to protect himself by expecting nothing good from anyone who approaches him. I cannot fault him for that, given how many must come to his door only when they need something. And you? What did you come needing?" "The same as everyone else," Margaret admitted. "Time, mercy, a chance." Her mother reached out and took her hand. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you have done more than your father managed in 2 years of silence. Whatever comes of it, be proud of that." Margaret nodded, though pride was the furthest thing from her mind as she finally rose and made her way to her own room. She undressed slowly, laid out her second-best dress for the morning, since her best was already creased from the day's travel, and sat by the window for a long while, watching the dark shapes of the trees sway beyond the glass. She thought of her father's ledgers, stacked high with numbers that meant nothing to her but ruin. She thought of the portraits in the hallway, of grandparents who had built the modest house from nothing, who would be ashamed to see it slip away over a debt born of bad harvests and worse luck. And she thought, despite herself, of gray eyes that had studied her with something more complicated than indifference. She had gone to Ashcombe Hall to beg for mercy. She did not yet know that mercy was not what waited for her there. Margaret returned to Ashcombe Hall the next afternoon with her stomach twisted into knots she could not untangle. The butler led her through the same long corridor, past the same towering paintings, and into the same study where Julian stood waiting, though this time he did not have his back turned toward the door. He watched her enter, his expression as unreadable as it had been the day before, though something in the set of his jaw suggested he had spent the night deciding something important. "Sit," he said, and she did, folding her hands in her lap the way she had before, bracing herself for whatever answer he had settled on. "I have thought about your request," Julian began, moving to stand behind his desk rather than sitting, as though he needed the distance to say what came next. "And I have decided that an extension would accomplish nothing. Your father does not have the means to repay this debt in 3 days, and he will not have the means in 3 months, or 3 years. The problem is not time, it is capacity." Margaret's heart sank, the brief hope she had allowed herself the night before collapsing into something heavier than before. "Then you mean to take the house?" "I did not say that either." Julian's gray eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I have another proposal, one I suspect you will find far stranger than an extension." "Stranger how?" "I am prepared to erase your father's debt entirely," he said, "every shilling of it, struck from the ledgers as though it never existed." Margaret stared at him, certain she had misheard. "Erase it? Why would you do that? You have said yourself the debt will not be repaid." "Because I ask something in return," Julian said. "Not money, something else." A cold feeling crept up Margaret's spine, and she straightened in her chair, suddenly wary. "What else could my family possibly offer you? We have nothing." "You have yourself," Julian said, and the words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. "I am asking you to marry me, Margaret Ellison. In exchange, your father's debt disappears, your family keeps their home, and your brothers grow up without the shadow of ruin hanging over them." For a long moment, Margaret could not speak. She had come prepared for many outcomes, refusal, delay, even cruelty, but not this. Not a proposal delivered as coldly as a business transaction, from a man she had met only once, a man whose reputation for heartlessness had followed her all the way from her own kitchen table. "You cannot be serious," she finally managed. "I am entirely serious. I do not make jests of this nature." "You do not know me," Margaret said, rising from her chair, her composure finally cracking under the weight of her disbelief. "You spoke with me for perhaps 20 minutes yesterday, and now you wish to marry me? This is not a proposal, Your Grace. This is a purchase. You are buying a wife the way you would buy a horse or a parcel of land, and you expect me to be grateful for the privilege." Something flashed in Julian's eyes then, not anger exactly, but a kind of surprised respect, as though her fury had confirmed something he suspected about her. "Perhaps it is a transaction," he admitted. "I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. I am a practical man, and I have long understood that my title requires a wife, an heir, a continuation of my family's line. I had intended to select someone suitable from among the families my mother once favored, women I have never spoken more than a few polite words to in my life. At least with you, I know something of your character. I know you do not flatter. I know you do not weep to win sympathy. I know you say what you mean, even when it costs you." "That is not the same as knowing me," Margaret said, though her voice had lost some of its heat. "No," he agreed, "but it is more than I would know of any other bride chosen for me by circumstance and family expectation. I am not asking you to love me, Margaret. I am asking you to save your family, and in exchange, I will provide you a life of comfort and security that you would not otherwise have. Whatever else this arrangement lacks, it does not lack honesty. I am telling you plainly what I want and what I offer. That is more than most men in my position would trouble themselves to do." Margaret turned away from him, walking toward the window, needing distance from the intensity of his gaze to think clearly. Outside, the ground stretched on endlessly, green and manicured and utterly foreign to the modest world she had grown up in. If she said yes, this would become her home. This stranger would become her husband. Everything familiar would be traded for wealth she had not asked for, and a marriage built on nothing but necessity. And yet, if she said no, her family would lose everything. Her brothers would grow up without a roof over their heads. Her mother's garden, tended for 2 decades, would belong to strangers. Her father, already broken by shame, would carry the full weight of that failure for the rest of his life. "I would need time to consider," she said finally. Though even as she spoke the words, she suspected there was no real decision to be made. There had never been a true choice in this room, not really. There was only the debt, and the house, and the family she loved more than her own comfort. "Consider it then," Julian said, and for a moment his voice lost some of its formality. "I will not pretend this offer is romantic, Margaret. I know precisely how it must sound to you, a stranger proposing marriage across a desk, as though negotiating the sale of livestock. But I have watched my own mother endure a marriage built entirely on false affection, a husband who whispered love while betraying her trust at every turn. I have come to believe that honesty, even cold honesty, serves a marriage better than pretty lies ever could. I offer you the truth of what this is. Nothing more, nothing less." Margaret studied him for a long moment, surprised by the flicker of vulnerability that had slipped into his voice, quickly hidden again beneath his usual composure. "Your mother," she said carefully. "You speak of her in the past." "She died when I was 19, Julian said. "My father followed 2 years later. I have run this estate and everything attached to it since I was 21. There has been little room in my life for anything but ledgers and obligations since then." "That sounds lonely," Margaret said before she could stop herself. Something shifted in his expression, quick and unguarded, gone before she could name it. "I have not thought of it in those terms for a long while," he admitted. "One learns not to." The confession, small as it was, softened something in Margaret's chest that she had not expected to feel toward this man. She had walked into Ashcombe Hall prepared to see only the cold, calculating duke of rumor and reputation. She had not expected to glimpse, even briefly, the lonely man beneath the title. "I will give you my answer tomorrow," she said again, gentler this time than before. "You have until tomorrow morning," Julian said. "I do not offer this arrangement lightly, and I will not leave it open indefinitely. If you refuse, the debt stands, and your family will need to find another solution before the week is out." Margaret nodded, though she felt as though the ground beneath her had shifted entirely. She left the study without another word, and this time, when she climbed into the carriage, she did not cry. She simply sat, staring at her own hands, trying to understand how a single conversation had rearranged the entire shape of her future. That evening, she told her parents everything. Her father, to her surprise, wept, not from shame this time, but from something closer to disbelief. "He would truly erase the debt?" he asked. "All of it?" "All of it," Margaret confirmed, "in exchange for my hand." Her mother sat very still, her expression difficult to read. "This is your choice to make, Margaret. No one will force you into this." "There is no true choice," Margaret said quietly. "Not really. If I refuse, we lose everything. If I accept, we lose nothing but my own freedom, and perhaps that is a smaller price than it feels tonight." Her father reached for her hand across the table. "I would not have you sacrifice yourself for my mistakes." "It is not only for your mistakes," Margaret said. "It is for Peter, and Simon, and Mother's garden, and this house, and every memory we have built inside these walls. If a marriage can save all of that, then perhaps it is not so terrible a price to pay." She did not sleep well that night. She thought of Julian's gray eyes, the strange mixture of coldness and honesty in his voice, the way he had spoken of the arrangement without pretending it was anything other than what it was. There was something almost comforting in his bluntness, she realized. He had not lied to her, had not dressed the transaction in false romance or empty promises. Whatever else awaited her at Ashcombe Hall, at least she would not be deceived about its nature. She rose before dawn and walked out into the small garden her mother had tended for 20 years, the frost still clinging to the grass beneath her slippers. She thought of the years she had spent imagining what her life might become, quiet dreams of a modest match, a husband chosen from among the local families, a life not so different from her mother's. None of those dreams had included a duke, or a debt, or a proposal delivered like a business arrangement across a wide oak desk. And yet, standing in the cold morning air, she found herself thinking less of what she was losing and more of what waited ahead, uncertain and strange as it was. Her younger brother Peter found her there, rubbing sleep from his eyes, still in his nightclothes. "Are you truly going to marry the Duke?" he asked, with the blunt curiosity only a child could manage. "It seems that I am," Margaret said, smiling despite herself. "Will you still visit us? Or will you become too grand for your own family once you live in that enormous house?" Margaret knelt down and took her brother's face in her hands. "I could never become too grand for you, Peter. Whatever house I live in, whatever name I carry, You will always be my brother, and I will always come home to see you." Peter seemed satisfied with this answer, and Margaret watched him run back inside, his bare feet slapping against the cold stone path, unburdened by the weight that had settled so heavily upon her own shoulders. She envied him, briefly, the simplicity of his understanding. To him, this was only a story about his sister marrying a duke. He did not yet understand the debt, or the desperation, or the strange bargain that had made it all possible. By morning, her decision had settled into something resembling peace. She dressed carefully, though not extravagantly, for she owned nothing extravagant to wear, and asked her father to accompany her to Ashcombe Hall one final time. When she stood again in Julian's study, she did not hesitate. "I accept," she said, "on one condition." Julian raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting conditions from a woman in her position, though he did not seem displeased by her nerve. "Name it." "You will not treat me as a purchase once the marriage is settled," Margaret said. "Whatever this arrangement is built upon, I will not spend the rest of my life as an ornament in your house, silent and grateful. If I am to be your wife, I will be treated as one, with respect, and with honesty, always." For the first time since she had met him, something that might almost have been a smile touched the corner of Julian's mouth. "That," he said, "is a condition I can agree to." Behind her, Margaret heard her father exhale a long, shuddering breath of relief. He rose from his chair and extended a trembling hand toward Julian, though his voice, when it came, was thick with emotion he could barely contain. "Your Grace, I do not know how to thank you for this mercy. My daughter's happiness matters more to me than any debt could ever weigh against it. I only ask that you keep the promise you have made her today." "I intend to," Julian said simply, and there was something in the plainness of his answer that reassured Margaret's father more than any grand declaration could have. The papers were drawn up within the week, the debt struck from the ledgers exactly as promised, and word of the engagement spread through the county faster than Margaret could have imagined possible. Some neighbors whispered that she had secured the match of the century. Others murmured that the Duke had finally lost patience with tradition and chosen convenience over propriety. Margaret paid little attention to either version of the gossip. She knew the truth of it better than anyone, the fear, the desperation, and the strange, uncertain honesty that had somehow carried her from a debtor's daughter to a duke's intended bride in the space of 2 conversations. As she stood in that vast study, shaking hands with the man who would soon become her husband, Margaret allowed herself for just a moment to wonder what kind of life waited for her beyond the walls of Ashcombe Hall, and whether the coldness she had first mistaken for cruelty might, given time, reveal itself to be something else entirely. The wedding took place quietly, without the grand spectacle the county had expected from a duke's marriage. Margaret stood before the small gathering in a gown far simpler than the occasion perhaps demanded, and Julian, standing beside her, wore an expression so carefully composed that only Margaret, who had begun to learn the language of his silences, could see the faint nervousness beneath it. Within a fortnight, she found herself standing in the entrance hall of Ashcombe Hall not as a visitor pleading for mercy, but as its mistress, a title she was still learning to wear. The house itself seemed to watch her, vast and echoing, filled with portraits of ancestors whose stern faces seemed to question her right to walk these halls. The staff treated her with careful politeness, though she could sense their uncertainty, their unspoken questions about the strange, sudden bride their master had chosen. Only one servant, a young maid named Alice, seemed to regard her without suspicion, offering small kindnesses, a warm cup of tea in the mornings, directions through the labyrinth of corridors that Margaret still had not fully mastered. "You'll find your way soon enough, my lady," Alice told her one morning, catching Margaret hesitating at a fork in the hallway. "I got lost for a full month when I first came here. This house has a way of testing a person's patience." "It certainly seems intent on testing mine," Margaret said, and Alice laughed, a bright, genuine sound that felt like the first true warmth Margaret had encountered since arriving. Julian, for his part, remained largely as he had been in their first conversations, formal and reserved, though Margaret began to notice small inconsistencies in his coldness, moments that did not quite fit the reputation that preceded him. She found him one evening in the library, not reviewing ledgers as she expected, but reading a worn volume of poetry, tucked into a chair by the fire, as though he had forgotten the world outside its pages. He looked up when she entered, and for a brief moment, something almost like embarrassment crossed his face before he composed himself again. "I did not expect company," he said, setting the book aside. "You needn't stop on my account," Margaret said, moving further into the room. "I did not realize you had an interest in poetry." "It was my mother's collection," Julian admitted after a pause. "I do not often have occasion to read it. Old habits, perhaps, from a time before responsibilities filled every hour of my day. Margaret sat across from him, curiosity overtaking her earlier hesitation. "Will you read something to me?" He seemed surprised by the request, though not unwilling. He opened the book again and read a short verse in a low, measured voice, and Margaret found herself watching him rather than listening closely to the words, noticing the way the firelight softened the sharp lines of his face, the way his guarded expression eased, just slightly, in the quiet privacy of the library. It became, in the weeks that followed, a small ritual between them, an hour in the evening spent in shared silence, sometimes with poetry, sometimes with nothing but the crackle of the fire and the comfortable absence of conversation. Margaret found herself looking forward to these hours more than she cared to admit, small threads of trust weaving themselves quietly between two people who had begun their union as strangers bound by necessity. She wrote to her family often during those early weeks, letters full of small details that felt too fragile to share aloud with anyone in the household. She told her mother of the enormous kitchen garden that stretched behind the house, larger than their entire property, and of the elderly gardener who reminded her so much of her own father that she often found herself lingering there simply to hear him speak of roses and soil. She told Peter and Simon of the stables, of a gray mare that had taken a particular liking to her, nudging at her pockets for apples whenever she visited. She did not tell them of the strange, uncertain flutter she felt whenever Julian looked at her a moment too long across the dinner table, unsure herself what that feeling meant or where it might lead. Dinner in those early weeks remained a formal affair, conducted in a dining room so large that Margaret and Julian sat at opposite ends of a table meant for 20, their voices carrying strangely across the polished wood between them. It was Margaret who finally suggested one evening that they might sit closer together, a small practicality that Julian agreed to with a faint, surprised smile, as though the idea had simply never occurred to him in all his years of solitary meals. "You have lived a very lonely life, I think," Margaret said one such evening, watching him across the shorter distance between their new seats. "I had not thought of it as loneliness," Julian admitted, "only as the natural order of things. My father was much the same, distant even from those closest to him. I suppose I learned early that affection was a luxury this family could not always afford, not when there was an estate to manage and a title to uphold." "That sounds like a very heavy inheritance," Margaret said softly. "Heavier than most people realize," Julian agreed, and for a moment, something raw and unguarded passed between them, a recognition of shared burdens carried in very different forms. Margaret had inherited her family's debt and desperation. Julian had inherited an empire of obligation and a coldness he had never chosen but had learned to wear as armor nonetheless. These small moments of understanding accumulated slowly, like stones laid one upon another to build something sturdy enough to bear weight. Margaret began to see past the reputation that had preceded him, past the cold, calculating duke the county whispered about, toward the man who read poetry by firelight and spoke gently to grieving stable boys and corrected mistakes with patience rather than cruelty. She also began to notice him in smaller, unguarded moments beyond the library. She saw him pause outside the stables one morning to speak with a young groom whose father had recently fallen ill, offering not just words of sympathy but practical help, a physician sent for. Wages continued despite the boy's reduced hours. She saw him correct a steward gently rather than harshly when accounts were miscounted, patient in a way his reputation had never suggested he could be. Piece by piece, the cold, calculating Duke of Rumor began to give way to someone more complicated, more human than Margaret had expected to find beneath the title. It was during this fragile, early period of tentative trust that Beatrice arrived at Ashcombe Hall. She came as a distant cousin of Julian's late mother, a woman whose circumstances had grown difficult enough that Julian, out of a sense of family obligation, had offered her a place within the household until a more permanent arrangement could be found. Beatrice was beautiful in a sharp, deliberate way, her every gesture calculated for effect, her smile never quite reaching the coldness that lingered behind her eyes. From the moment she arrived, Margaret sensed something unsettled beneath her polished manners, though she could not yet name what troubled her. "You must be the new Duchess," Beatrice said, upon their first meeting in the drawing room, her tone pleasant enough on the surface, though something beneath it felt like a blade wrapped in silk. "How fortunate for you to have secured such a match. Julian has always been so difficult to please." "I did not set out to please him," Margaret said carefully, "only to survive a difficult circumstance my family faced." "Of course," Beatrice said, her smile widening slightly. "How practical of you both. I do hope it proves a lasting arrangement. Julian has had his heart bruised before, you understand. He is not always as trusting as he might appear, The comment lingered with Margaret long after Beatrice had left the room, a small seed of unease planted where none had existed before. She mentioned it to Alice later that evening, as the maid helped her prepare for bed. "Pay her little mind, my lady," Alice said, brushing out Margaret's hair with practiced care. "Miss Beatrice has been angling for the Duke's attention since long before you arrived. Some in the household believe she hoped to secure the match herself, before His Grace's sudden marriage put an end to those particular ambitions." Margaret absorbed this information carefully, turning it over in her mind. It explained, at least in part, the coldness she had sensed beneath Beatrice's polished manners, the careful, calculated way she measured Margaret with every glance. It did not, however, ease the unsettled feeling that had taken root in Margaret's chest, a quiet certainty that Beatrice's presence in the household would not remain harmless for long. Over the following weeks, Margaret watched Beatrice carefully, noting the small ways she inserted herself into moments that belonged to Julian and Margaret alone. She appeared unbidden during their evening hours in the library, claiming to seek a book she had misplaced, lingering longer than any search required. She commented, in front of the household staff, on how unusual it was for a duke to marry so quickly, so quietly, planting doubts in careful, deniable phrases that left no clear accusation to answer. At a small gathering Julian hosted for a handful of neighboring families, Beatrice made certain to seat herself beside him, engaging him in conversation about people and places from his past that Margaret knew nothing of, old family friends, childhood memories, a shared history that excluded Margaret entirely from its warmth. Margaret watched from across the room, forcing polite smiles for the guests who approached her, while some quiet, unwelcome part of her wondered whether she would ever truly belong in this world of old names and older histories, no matter how carefully she learned its customs. "Your cousin seems very familiar with the Duke," one of the visiting ladies remarked to Margaret, not unkindly, though the observation still landed with unwelcome weight. "They grew up nearly as siblings, I understand, before circumstances separated their families for some years." "I did not know that," Margaret admitted, surprised by how much the small revelation unsettled her. "Oh yes, quite close they were, as children. Some in the county always assumed a match between them was only a matter of time, before His Grace's marriage came as such a surprise to everyone." The comment lingered with Margaret long after the guests had departed, another small stone added to the growing weight of unease Beatrice's presence had introduced into the household. She said nothing of it to Julian that evening, uncertain how to raise the subject without sounding as though she doubted him, though the seed of uncertainty had, despite her best efforts, begun to take root. Alice noticed the shift in Margaret's mood over the following days, the way she grew quieter during their morning routines, the careful distraction in her expression whenever Beatrice's name arose in conversation. "You mustn't let her trouble you so, my lady," Alice said one morning, arranging Margaret's hair with gentle, practiced hands. "Miss Beatrice has always had a talent for making others doubt themselves. It is, I think, the only real skill she possesses. She seems to know a great deal about the Duke's past," Margaret said, "things I have not yet learned myself." "Knowing someone's past is not the same as understanding their heart," Alice said wisely, and Margaret found herself grateful, not for the first time, for the maid's steady, uncomplicated kindness in a household that seemed increasingly full of careful hidden currents she did not yet know how to navigate. "It is only natural people will wonder," Beatrice said one afternoon, when Margaret confronted her gently about the comments that had reached her ears. "A sudden marriage, a debt conveniently erased. Surely you understand how such circumstances might invite speculation, even among those who wish you well." "And do you wish me well, Beatrice?" Margaret asked directly, tired of the careful games that had defined their every interaction since her cousin's arrival. Beatrice's smile did not waver, though something colder settled behind her eyes. "Of course, my lady. I only wish to see Julian happy. He has suffered enough disappointment in his life. I would hate to see him hurt again by circumstances he did not fully understand when he entered into them." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but unmistakable, and Margaret felt, for the first time since her arrival at Ashcombe Hall, a genuine chill of apprehension. Whatever fragile trust she had begun building with Julian, whatever quiet warmth had grown between them in shared evenings by the fire, Beatrice seemed intent on unraveling it thread by careful thread, and Margaret was not yet certain how to stop her. That evening she found Julian in the library as usual, though his expression seemed more distant than it had been in recent weeks, his attention divided between the book in his hands and something else entirely. "Is something troubling you?" Margaret asked, settling into her usual chair across from him. "Beatrice mentioned something to me today," Julian said carefully, not quite meeting her eyes, "about the circumstances of our marriage, about whether it was entered into with full honesty on both sides. Margaret's stomach tightened. What exactly did she say? That perhaps your family's gratitude for the erased debt had shaped your feelings toward me more than any genuine affection. That I ought to consider whether I had been chosen for myself, or merely for what I could provide. The words stung more deeply than Margaret expected, not because they held any truth, but because she could see, in the careful way Julian avoided her gaze, that some small part of him had begun to wonder the same thing. You know the circumstances of our marriage as well as I do, Margaret said, keeping her voice steady despite the hurt rising in her chest. There was never any pretense between us. You offered a transaction, and I accepted it honestly, without hiding the reasons behind my choice. If Beatrice suggests there was ever deception in that arrangement, she suggests something false. I know, Julian said, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. And yet doubt, once planted, has a way of growing roots even in soil that should not welcome it. Margaret studied him for a long moment, searching his face for some sign of the man who had read poetry to her by the fire, who had spoken so plainly of loneliness in his own study weeks before. He was still there, she believed, somewhere beneath this sudden uncertainty, but Beatrice's careful words had clearly found purchase in whatever guarded corner of his heart still remembered old wounds and older betrayals. I will not defend myself against implications with no substance behind them, Margaret said finally, rising from her chair. If you have questions about my honesty, ask them of me directly, and I will answer them, as I have always answered you, plainly and without pretense. But I will not compete with whispers I cannot see or address. She left the library that evening with her composure intact, though her heart carried a heaviness that had not been there before Beatrice's arrival. She passed the portraits in the hallway on her way to her chambers, the same stern ancestral faces that had seemed to question her presence on her very first day at Ashcombe Hall, and found herself wondering, not for the first time, whether she would ever truly earn a place among them, or whether she would always remain, in the eyes of this house and everyone within it, the debtor's daughter who had married her way out of ruin. In her room she sat by the window for a long while, watching the moon rise over the grounds she had once found so foreign and now, despite everything, had slowly begun to think of as home. She thought of Julian's uncertain expression in the library, the doubt Beatrice had so carefully planted, and the shared history between cousin and Duke that Margaret had known nothing about until a stranger's careless remark revealed it to her. She did not believe, not truly, that Julian's feelings for her were as hollow as Beatrice suggested. But she understood, with a clarity that settled uncomfortably in her chest, that belief alone would not be enough to protect the fragile trust they had built. Beatrice was patient, and calculating, and clearly unwilling to abandon whatever plan had brought her to Ashcombe Hall in the first place. Whatever quiet trust had begun to grow between herself and Julian now stood on uncertain ground, and Margaret understood, walking alone through the darkened corridors of Ashcombe Hall, that the true battle for her marriage had only just begun. A letter arrived for Margaret one gray morning, delivered by the household post along with the usual correspondence for the estate. She recognized the handwriting immediately, familiar and warm, a letter from her old friend Henry, whom she had known since childhood, before her family's fortunes had collapsed, and before Ashcombe Hall had ever entered her life. Henry had once courted her briefly, years earlier, though nothing had come of it beyond a gentle, unspoken affection that had faded into simple friendship once his own family's circumstances had led him elsewhere. She read his letter with genuine pleasure, full of ordinary news, his recent travels, his sister's upcoming marriage, small pleasantries exchanged between old friends who had not corresponded in far too long. She set the letter aside on her writing desk, intending to answer it that evening, and thought nothing more of it. Beatrice found it there the following afternoon. Margaret did not learn of this immediately. She only noticed, over the following days, a growing coolness in Julian's manner that she could not account for. Their evening hours in the library grew shorter, then stopped altogether. He began taking his meals separately, citing pressing estate business that kept him occupied until well past the dinner hour. When their paths did cross in the hallways or the drawing room, his greetings grew formal again, distant in a way that reminded Margaret uncomfortably of their very first meeting, before any warmth had grown between them. "Have I done something to trouble you?" Margaret finally asked, cornering him one evening in the corridor outside his study, unwilling to endure another day of unexplained silence. "No," Julian said, though his eyes did not quite meet hers. "I have simply had a great deal to attend to." "That is not the truth," Margaret said, "and we agreed, when I accepted your proposal, that honesty would remain between us, whatever else this marriage might lack." Julian's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Margaret thought he might finally speak plainly. Instead, he simply shook his head. Some matters require more thought before they can be discussed. I would ask for your patience a little longer. He left her standing alone in the corridor, more unsettled than she had been in weeks, certain now that something had shifted, though she could not yet name its source. She thought back, in the days that followed, to something Julian had once told her in a rare, unguarded moment, weeks earlier, when their evenings in the library had still felt easy and warm. He had spoken briefly, almost reluctantly, of a woman his father had once favored as a potential bride for him, a woman who had, in the end, revealed her interest to be entirely rooted in his title and fortune, rather than any genuine regard for him as a person. He had discovered letters, he told Margaret then, correspondence between the woman and another suitor of far greater wealth, proof that her attentions toward Julian had only ever been a means of securing the highest possible offer available to her. The betrayal had come at 19, in the same difficult year that had claimed his mother, and Margaret understood now, with painful clarity, why a single letter from an old friend could unravel so much trust so quickly. Julian was not simply a cold man by nature. He was a man who had learned, through bitter experience, that affection could not always be trusted, and Beatrice, whether through careful research or simple cousinly familiarity, had known exactly which old wound to reopen. Margaret found her father-in-law's old steward, a patient, graying man named Mr. Whitfield, in the estate office one afternoon, reviewing accounts with the same careful diligence he had likely brought to the position for decades. She had come seeking nothing in particular, only some quiet distraction from the tension that had settled over the household, but found herself lingering to speak with him regardless. "You have served this family a long while, Mr. Whitfield," Margaret said, taking a seat across from his cluttered desk. "Since before his grace was born, my lady," Whitfield said, not looking up from his ledgers. "I remember him as a boy, quick to laugh, before circumstances taught him otherwise." "What circumstances do you mean?" Whitfield paused, considering his words carefully. "It is not my place to speak of family matters, my lady, but I will say this. His grace was not always so guarded as you find him now. Grief changes a man, and betrayal changes him further still. He has spent many years building walls around himself that few have ever managed to breach. And yet you believe those walls can still come down?" Margaret asked. Whitfield finally looked up, a faint, knowing warmth in his expression. "I have watched him these past months, my lady, since your arrival. I have seen more of the boy I once knew in him these recent weeks than in all the years since his parents passed. Whatever has changed in him, I do not believe it changed by accident." The old steward's words offered Margaret a small measure of comfort, though they did little to ease the immediate crisis unfolding around her. Whatever growth had taken root during her early weeks at Ashcombe Hall remained fragile, vulnerable to exactly the kind of careful manipulation Beatrice had proven so skilled at deploying. She found the answer 3 days later, when Alice, clearly troubled, approached her while helping to arrange her hair for the evening. "My lady, I do not know if it is my place to speak of this," Alice began carefully, "but I overheard something I believe you ought to know." "Tell me," Margaret said, her stomach already tightening with apprehension. "Miss Beatrice found a letter on your writing desk, my lady, one addressed from a gentleman she claimed you had known before your marriage. She took it to his grace and suggested that you had been carrying on a private correspondence with a former suitor, hidden from him, and that perhaps your affections had never fully settled upon your marriage at all." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. "The letter was from Henry, an old friend of my family's, nothing more. There was nothing hidden about it. I left it openly upon my own desk, intending to answer it honestly, as I would any correspondence." "I believe you, my lady," Alice said gently. "But Miss Beatrice did not present it that way to his grace. She suggested the timing was suspicious, that you had perhaps sought a more advantageous match all along and kept the door open to it, should your circumstances with the Duke prove disappointing." Margaret sat very still, absorbing the full weight of the accusation, understanding at last the source of Julian's sudden coldness. She had done nothing wrong, had hidden nothing, had given him no true reason for suspicion, and yet Beatrice's careful poison had clearly found fertile ground in whatever old wound still lingered beneath his composed exterior, the same wound, perhaps, that had made him so guarded and distant when Margaret first met him. "I must speak with him," Margaret said, rising immediately, though Alice caught her hand gently before she could leave the room. "Choose your moment carefully, my lady. His grace is not a man easily persuaded by anger, however justified. He listens best when approached with patience, not confrontation." Margaret took the advice to heart, though patience did not come easily to her in the days that followed. She watched Julian withdraw further into his old coldness, the careful walls he had built around himself long before she arrived rising again between them, brick by careful brick, undoing weeks of fragile trust in a matter of days. She attempted, several times, to raise the subject of Henry's letter directly, but Julian deflected each attempt with practiced skill, retreating into discussions of estate business or excusing himself entirely from her company. It was as though he had decided, somewhere in the quiet of his own thoughts, that confronting the accusation directly would force him to face a truth he was not yet prepared to examine, whether his growing feelings for Margaret had been real, or whether he had simply been a fool to trust so quickly after so many years of careful guardedness. Even Alice grew increasingly protective during this period, taking small liberties she might not otherwise have allowed herself, quietly informing Margaret of Beatrice's movements throughout the house, of overheard conversations that hinted at further schemes still forming. She spoke with the housekeeper yesterday about rearranging the seating for the harvest dinner His Grace intends to host next month, Alice mentioned one morning. Suggested she ought to sit nearer to him, given how uncomfortable the tension between yourself and His Grace has apparently become. She wastes no opportunity, Margaret murmured, more to herself than to Alice. No, my lady, she does not, but neither, I think, will you, once you set your mind to something. Beatrice, for her part, grew bolder in Margaret's absence from Julian's company, seizing every opportunity to occupy the spaces Margaret had once filled. She joined Julian for his morning rides across the estate, a habit Margaret herself had begun to share with him in recent weeks. She lingered in the library during the very hours that had once belonged to Margaret and Julian's quiet evenings together, filling the silence with conversation about shared memories from their childhood that Margaret could never hope to match. You seem troubled, cousin, Beatrice remarked to Margaret one afternoon, finding her alone in the drawing room, her tone carrying that familiar, deniable edge of false concern. I do hope nothing is amiss between yourself and Julian. Marriages built so quickly, on such practical foundations, can sometimes prove fragile when tested by circumstance. Is that what you hope for, Beatrice? Margaret asked directly, tired of the careful games that had defined every interaction between them since her cousin's arrival. A fragile marriage easily broken? Beatrice's smile did not waver, though something colder flickered behind her eyes. I hope only for Julian's happiness, as I have always said. If that happiness is better served by circumstances other than your marriage, I would not consider that an unfortunate outcome. The confession, thinly veiled as it was, confirmed everything Margaret had suspected since her arrival at Ashcombe Hall. Beatrice had not come to the household out of simple family obligation. She had come with purpose, patient and calculating, waiting for the right moment to unravel a marriage she had never wanted to succeed in the first place. Margaret returned to her chambers that evening, more resolved than frightened, understanding now, with complete clarity, the nature of the battle she faced. She would not win Julian's trust back through patience alone, not while Beatrice remained free to whisper doubts into every quiet moment they might otherwise have shared. She needed proof, something undeniable that would expose Beatrice's manipulations for exactly what they were, before the damage done to her marriage became too deep to repair. She thought of Alice's careful warning, of Julian's guarded nature, of the old wound that had clearly shaped his instinct to withdraw rather than confront uncertainty directly. Whatever plan she settled upon, it would need to account for all of this, a careful, deliberate strategy rather than a desperate confrontation born of hurt feelings alone. That night, unable to sleep, Margaret rose from her bed and made her way quietly to the study, uncertain what she hoped to find there, only certain that answers existed somewhere within this house, waiting to be uncovered by someone patient and determined enough to search for them. The study was dark, lit only by the last embers of a dying fire, and Margaret moved carefully among Julian's neatly organized papers, searching for anything that might explain the full extent of Beatrice's interference. She found nothing that first night, though her resolve only strengthened with the search. Somewhere in this house, she was certain, lay proof of Beatrice's true intentions, and Margaret would not rest until she had uncovered it, whatever the cost to her own composure in the process. Her own father visited briefly that week, having heard through neighborhood gossip that all was not entirely well at Ashcombe Hall, though the specific nature of the trouble had not yet reached him clearly. Margaret received him in the drawing room, careful to keep her composure intact despite the exhaustion of recent days. "You seem tired, my dear," her father observed, studying her with the particular concern only a parent could carry. "Is the Duke treating you well? You must tell me honestly, whatever the truth may be." "He treats me with nothing but honor," Margaret assured him, and the words, though carefully chosen, were entirely true. Whatever coldness had returned to Julian's manner in recent days, he had never once been unkind to her. never once raised his voice or treated her with anything less than the respect he had promised on the day she accepted his proposal. There are simply difficulties within the household that have nothing to do with his character, difficulties I intend to resolve myself. Her father did not press further, trusting her judgment as he always had, though his visit left Margaret with renewed determination. She had not accepted Julian's proposal, only to watch her marriage crumble beneath the careful machinations of a jealous cousin. Whatever it cost her, she intended to fight for the fragile trust she and Julian had built together, and for the deeper feeling that had begun to grow alongside it, one she had not yet found the courage to name even to herself. She returned to her chambers before dawn, exhausted but resolute, understanding that the fragile peace of her early marriage had ended, and a far more difficult chapter had begun, one that would require every ounce of courage and patience she possessed to survive intact. Margaret returned to Julian's study 3 nights later, having learned from Alice that Beatrice often retired early, giving Margaret a window of privacy she intended to use fully. This time, she searched with greater purpose, methodically working through the drawers and correspondence that lined the room, uncertain exactly what she sought, but trusting that something within these walls would reveal the full truth of Beatrice's manipulations. She found it in a drawer near the bottom of Julian's desk, tucked beneath a stack of unrelated correspondence, as though someone had wanted it hidden but not destroyed entirely. It was a letter, written in Beatrice's own careful hand, addressed not to Julian but to Henry, the old friend whose innocent correspondence had started this entire painful chapter. Margaret read it with growing horror, understanding immediately what she held in her trembling hands. The letter, dated only days after Henry's original correspondence had arrived, was written as though from Margaret herself, using a careful imitation of her handwriting, thanking Henry for his continued affection, and suggesting that circumstances at Ashcombe Hall had grown difficult enough that she might welcome a renewed connection between them, should her marriage prove as unhappy as she feared it might become. It was a forgery, cruel and calculated, designed either to be intercepted by Julian himself, confirming his worst suspicions, or to draw a genuine response from Henry that could later be presented as evidence of Margaret's supposed infidelity. Fortunately, it seemed the letter had never been sent. Whether Beatrice had lost her nerve or whether some other obstacle had prevented its delivery, Margaret could not say, but the unsent forgery in her hands provided exactly the proof she needed, undeniable evidence of her cousin's deliberate scheme to destroy her marriage from within. She searched further, driven now by a determination that overpowered whatever exhaustion had settled into her limbs, and found a second piece of evidence tucked into the same drawer. A brief note in Beatrice's hand addressed to Julian's steward, Mr. Whitfield, requesting that certain household accounts be adjusted to suggest Margaret had ordered expensive alterations to her own private chambers without her husband's knowledge or approval. It was a smaller deception than the forged letter, but no less deliberate. Another careful thread woven into the same design, intended to paint Margaret as extravagant and dishonest, unworthy of the trust Julian had begun to place in her. Margaret understood now, with complete clarity, the scope of what she faced. Beatrice had not acted on a single impulse of jealousy. She had constructed, patiently and methodically, an entire architecture of doubt, each small deception reinforcing the others, designed to unravel Margaret's marriage thread by careful thread, until nothing remained but suspicion and ruin. The realization steadied her rather than frightened her further. Whatever fear she had carried into this study had hardened, by the time she left it, into something closer to resolve. She returned to her chambers, as dawn began to lighten the sky beyond her window. The forged letter and the fabricated account both secured carefully among her own private papers, evidence she intended to use not out of vengeance, but out of simple necessity. Her marriage, fragile as it remained, deserved the chance to be built upon truth, rather than the careful lies Beatrice had spent weeks constructing around it. She sat in the darkened study for a long while, the letter clutched tightly in her hands, torn between fury at Beatrice's cruelty and relief that she finally possessed something concrete enough to expose the truth. She thought of confronting Julian immediately, waking him from sleep to show him what she had found, but some careful instinct held her back. A private confession, delivered in the middle of the night, might too easily be dismissed or doubted, especially given how thoroughly Beatrice's earlier whispers had already taken root in Julian's guarded heart. Margaret needed something more definitive, a moment that would leave no room for doubt or careful deflection. The opportunity arrived sooner than she expected. Julian had planned a modest gathering for the following evening, a dinner intended to smooth over recent tensions with several neighboring families whose gossip about the sudden, strained atmosphere at Ashcombe Hall had begun to reach uncomfortable proportions. Beatrice, predictably, had positioned herself at the center of the preparations, eager to demonstrate her closeness to the household in front of witnesses who might carry the impression back into county society. Margaret spent the following day in careful preparation of her own, saying nothing to Julian of what she had discovered, though she noticed his eyes following her more closely than they had in recent weeks, as though some part of him sensed the shift in her demeanor, the quiet, contained determination that had replaced her earlier hurt and confusion. She spoke privately with Mr. Whitfield that afternoon, showing him the fabricated account note without revealing its full context, asking only whether he recognized the handwriting and whether any such alterations to her chambers had genuinely been requested through proper channels. "No such request ever reached my desk through proper channels, my lady," Whitfield confirmed, studying the note with a frown of growing concern. "And I do recognize this hand. It belongs to Miss Beatrice. I had assumed, when a similar note reached me some weeks ago, that it carried your authority, given how closely she has positioned herself within the household's daily affairs." "It did not," Margaret said simply, "and I suspect there may be other instances of the same deception, hidden throughout the household's recent affairs, wherever Miss Beatrice believed she could act without detection." Whitfield's expression hardened, decades of loyal service to the family clearly stirring beneath his usually placid manner. "If that is true, my lady, I would be glad to assist however I am able. This family has weathered enough difficulty without deception spreading further roots within its own walls." Armed with Whitfield's confirmation and quiet support, Margaret felt her resolve strengthen further still. She spent the remainder of the day moving through her usual routines with careful composure, giving no outward sign of the confrontation she had already begun planning for that evening's gathering. She visited the stables, where the gray mare nudged affectionately at her pockets as always, and found a strange comfort in the animal's simple, uncomplicated trust, a small reminder that not every relationship within these walls had been touched by Beatrice's careful poison. Alice helped her dress for dinner that evening with unusual care, sensing perhaps that something significant awaited, though Margaret had confided in no one beyond Whitfield about her exact intentions. "You look every inch the Duchess tonight, my lady," Alice said, adjusting a final pin in Margaret's hair. "Whatever awaits this evening, I believe you are prepared to meet it." "I hope you are right, Alice," Margaret said softly, studying her own reflection in the mirror, searching for some sign of the frightened, uncertain woman who had first arrived at Ashcombe Hall to beg for mercy so many weeks earlier. She found, instead, someone steadier, someone who had learned to stand her ground in rooms far grander and more intimidating than she had ever imagined facing. The dinner proceeded much as such gatherings did, polite conversation over a lavishly prepared table, careful pleasantries exchanged between families who had known each other for generations. Beatrice, seated closer to Julian than protocol might have suggested appropriate, dominated much of the conversation with stories from their shared childhood, glancing occasionally toward Margaret with a satisfaction she made little effort to hide. It was during a lull in the conversation, as servants cleared the second course, that Margaret rose from her seat. "Before we continue," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the table, steady despite the pounding of her own heart, "I believe there is a matter that deserves address, one that has caused considerable difficulty within this household in recent weeks." Julian's eyes snapped toward her, surprise evident in his expression, though he said nothing, watching her with the same careful attention he had shown throughout the evening. "Margaret, perhaps this is not the moment," Beatrice began, a note of warning entering her voice, though Margaret continued regardless, drawing the folded letter from where she had kept it hidden throughout the meal. "Several weeks ago, I received a letter from an old family friend, Henry, a man I have known since childhood, whose correspondence contained nothing beyond ordinary pleasantries between friends. That letter was found on my desk and brought to my husband's attention, along with the suggestion that I had been carrying on some secret correspondence, that my affections had never fully settled upon my marriage." She unfolded the forged letter slowly, allowing the assembled guests to see the paper clearly, though she did not yet reveal its full contents. "What I hold now is a letter written in an imitation of my own hand, addressed to that same friend, suggesting exactly the kind of unfaithfulness that has been quietly implied about me throughout this household. I did not write this letter. I found it hidden in my husband's study, evidence of a deliberate scheme to destroy the trust between myself and my husband." The table fell into stunned silence, and Beatrice's careful composure finally cracked, her face draining of color as every eye in the room turned toward her. "This is absurd," Beatrice said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "I have no idea what she is suggesting. Perhaps the letter is genuine, and she seeks only to deflect suspicion from herself by manufacturing this elaborate accusation." The handwriting can be examined by anyone familiar with my own correspondence, Margaret said calmly, though her hands trembled slightly as she held the letter aloft. My husband has received numerous letters from me since our engagement began. He knows my hand as well as anyone in this room. I would welcome that comparison, here and now, in front of every witness present. Julian rose slowly from his seat, taking the letter from Margaret's hands with careful deliberation. He studied it for a long moment, comparing it silently against some private memory of Margaret's own correspondence, his expression growing darker with each passing second. "This is not Margaret's hand," he said finally, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the silent room. "The letters are close, but the formation of certain characters differs entirely from her genuine correspondence. This is a forgery." He turned toward Beatrice, and whatever warmth had ever existed in their childhood familiarity seemed to drain entirely from his expression, replaced by something cold and unforgiving. "You wrote this." "Julian, I would never." "Do not lie to me further," Julian said, his voice rising for the first time that evening, sharp enough to silence whatever protest Beatrice had intended to offer. "I recognize your hand as well, cousin. We shared tutors as children. I have seen your handwriting 1,000 times across the years. This forgery bears your careful, deliberate strokes beneath its imitation of Margaret's style. You did this. You planted doubt between myself and my wife through careful whispers, and when that proved insufficient, you attempted to manufacture proof of infidelity that never existed." The assembled guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly unprepared for the drama unfolding before them, though none dared leave or interrupt the confrontation now consuming the room. "I did it for you," Beatrice finally admitted, her careful mask crumbling entirely under the weight of Julian's accusation. "You do not understand what I sacrificed, watching you marry a stranger, a debtor's daughter, with nothing to offer beyond a family's desperate circumstances. I have known you since we were children, Julian. I understood you before she ever arrived at this house. I only sought to show you the truth, that this marriage was built on nothing but convenience and desperation, unworthy of the trust you had so foolishly begun to place in it. You sought to destroy something you could not have for yourself," Julian said, his voice cold and final. "Whatever affection once existed between us as children, it does not excuse what you have done here tonight. You are no longer welcome within this household." Beatrice rose from the table, her composure entirely abandoned now, tears of humiliation and fury gathering in eyes that had, moments before, held nothing but calculated confidence. "You will regret this, Julian. You will realize soon enough that I understood your heart better than she ever could." She left the dining room without another word, and the assembled guests, still stunned into silence, watched her departure with the particular fascination reserved for scandal, too dramatic to look away from entirely. Julian remained standing for a long moment after Beatrice's exit, the forged letter still clutched in his hand, before he finally turned toward Margaret, his expression a complicated mixture of shame and something far gentler beneath it. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, loud enough only for her to hear amid the murmuring guests. "I allowed doubt to take root where none should have existed. I should have trusted you from the very beginning, rather than allowing old wounds to color my judgment of your character." "You have apologized enough for one evening," Margaret said softly, though something warm had begun to loosen in her chest at his words, the first genuine relief she had felt in what seemed like weeks of careful, exhausting tension. "We will speak further once our guests have gone." The remainder of the dinner proceeded awkwardly, guests offering careful, sympathetic glances toward Margaret, while studiously avoiding any direct mention of the scene that had unfolded. Margaret endured it with as much grace as she could manage, aware that whatever scandal Beatrice's exposure had created would likely occupy county gossip for weeks to come, though she found, to her own surprise, that she cared little for such concerns now that the truth had finally been laid bare before everyone who mattered. When the last guest had finally departed, Margaret and Julian stood alone in the entrance hall, the vast house settling into quiet around them for the first time since Beatrice's arrival had disrupted its fragile peace. "I do not know how to properly express how deeply I regret my own doubt," Julian said, his voice carrying none of its usual careful composure. "You deserved better than the suspicion I allowed to grow between us. You were hurt once, badly, by someone who deceived you in exactly the way Beatrice suggested I had deceived you," Margaret said gently. "I understand why her words found purchase in that old wound, even if I wish they had not." "That does not excuse it," Julian said. "You have given me nothing but honesty since the very first day we met, in that study, when you refused to weep or beg for mercy you had not yet earned. I should have remembered that honesty and trusted it, rather than allowing old fears to overshadow it." Margaret studied him for a long moment, seeing beneath his careful words the same lonely, guarded man she had first glimpsed weeks earlier, reading poetry by firelight, speaking quietly of loneliness he had never fully allowed himself to name. Whatever damage Beatrice's scheme had caused, it had also, in its own painful way, forced both of them to confront truths about their marriage that careful politeness might otherwise have left unspoken indefinitely. "Then let us begin again," Margaret said softly, "not as strangers bound by necessity, but as two people who have chosen, despite everything, to trust each other fully." Julian reached for her hand, his fingers closing gently around hers, and for the first time since their strange, transactional beginning, Margaret felt something settle between them that resembled not obligation, but genuine hope for whatever future still lay ahead. They stood together in the quiet entrance hall for a long while, neither speaking, the events of the evening settling slowly around them like dust after a long storm. Margaret thought of the frightened, uncertain woman who had first walked through these doors weeks earlier, prepared only to beg for mercy on her family's behalf, and marveled at how far she had traveled since that first difficult morning. She had not simply survived Beatrice's careful scheme. She had faced it directly, armed with nothing but evidence and quiet resolve, and emerged with something far more valuable than mere vindication, a husband who had finally chosen to see her clearly, without the shadow of old fears clouding his judgment. "Come," Julian said finally, releasing a long breath that seemed to carry with it weeks of accumulated tension. "It has been a difficult evening. Let us not spend what remains of it standing in this cold hallway." Margaret allowed him to lead her toward the library, their old familiar refuge, where a fresh fire had already been laid against the evening chill. They settled into their usual chairs, though neither reached immediately for a book, content instead simply to sit together in the comfortable silence that had once defined their early evenings, before Beatrice's arrival had disrupted its fragile peace. "I believe," Julian said quietly, after a long while, "that this house has needed someone like you for a very long time, Margaret. Longer than either of us understood when we first struck our unconventional bargain." Margaret smiled, something warm and unguarded finally settling fully into place within her chest. "Then perhaps," she said, "we ought to stop calling it a bargain at all." Beatrice departed Ashcombe Hall within 2 days, her belongings packed and sent ahead to a distant relation who had agreed, reluctantly, to take her in. Julian arranged the departure with the same careful efficiency he brought to every estate matter, though Margaret noticed a weariness in his manner that lingered long after the immediate crisis had resolved itself, the quiet exhaustion of a man confronting old wounds he had spent years avoiding entirely. "You seem troubled still," Margaret observed one evening, several days after the confrontation at dinner, finding him standing at the same study window where she had first met him, months earlier, as a desperate stranger seeking mercy. "I am thinking of my mother," Julian admitted, turning to face her. "She endured a marriage very similar to what I nearly allowed mine to become, poisoned by suspicion and doubt. Though in her case, the deception came from my father himself, rather than any outside interference. I watched her grow smaller and quieter across the years, until whatever spirit she once carried had almost entirely disappeared beneath the weight of a husband's careless indifference. I swore, long ago, that I would never treat a wife of my own in such a manner, and yet within months of our marriage, I allowed exactly that kind of doubt to take root between us." "You corrected your error," Margaret said gently, crossing the room to stand beside him. "That is not nothing, Julian. Many men would have allowed pride to keep them from admitting fault at all." "Perhaps," Julian said, though uncertainty still lingered in his voice. "But I find myself wondering whether you can truly trust that it will not happen again. Some future doubt, some future whisper finding purchase in whatever fears still remain buried beneath my composure." Margaret considered his words carefully before answering, understanding the depth of vulnerability required for him to voice such uncertainty aloud. "I cannot promise you will never doubt again," she said honestly. "Old wounds do not heal simply because we wish them to. But I can promise you this. I will always speak to you plainly, whatever doubt or fear finds its way into your heart, rather than allowing silence to grow between us the way it nearly did with Beatrice's interference. If you trust nothing else about me, Julian, trust that I will never let you wonder in silence again." Something shifted visibly in his expression then, the last of his guardedness finally softening into something Margaret had not yet seen from him directly, an openness that felt more vulnerable than anything he had offered her before. "I think," he said slowly, "that I have come to love you, Margaret. Not out of gratitude for the arrangement that brought us together, and not merely out of the comfortable trust we have built across these difficult months. Simply because of who you are, honest and brave and entirely unwilling to be diminished by circumstance, however difficult. Margaret felt her breath catch, the words landing with a weight she had not expected, though some quiet part of her realized she had been waiting to hear them for longer than she had allowed herself to admit. "I believe," she said softly, "that I have come to love you as well, somewhere between the poetry readings and the quiet evenings, and the way you correct your steward's mistakes with more patience than most men manage, even with their own children. I did not expect to find this, Julian, when I first walked into this study seeking nothing more than mercy for my family. And yet here we are," Julian said, reaching for her hand. "Here we are," Margaret agreed, and for the first time since her arrival at Ashcombe Hall, the vast house around them felt less like a foreign world she had been thrust into, and more like a home she had genuinely chosen, whatever strange circumstances had first brought her through its doors. A letter arrived from Henry a few weeks later, the innocent correspondence that had once caused so much unintended trouble now resolved entirely once the truth of Beatrice's scheme had come to light. Margaret answered it openly, this time in Julian's presence rather than alone, reading portions aloud to him as she composed her reply. Small, ordinary news of old friends and shared history that held no shadow of secrecy or suspicion. "You need not share every letter with me," Julian said, watching her write with a faint smile. "I trust you, Margaret, entirely. I do not require proof of your honesty in every correspondence you receive." "I know," Margaret said, "but I find I want to share it regardless. Not because you require it, but because there is no part of my life I wish to keep separate from you any longer." Julian's expression softened at this, and he reached across the small writing desk to cover her hand with his own, a simple gesture that carried more warmth than any grand declaration might have managed. Henry, for his part, later wrote to express his genuine happiness at Margaret's marriage, along with news of his own engagement to a young woman from a neighboring county, closing the small chapter of old affection with nothing but goodwill on all sides. The weeks that followed brought a kind of peace neither of them had known during the difficult early months of their marriage. Word of Beatrice's scheme had, inevitably, spread through county society, though the general sympathy fell heavily in Margaret's favor once the full details became known. Neighboring families who had once regarded her with polite curiosity now greeted her with genuine warmth, impressed by the composure and courage she had shown in exposing her cousin's deception so publicly. Margaret's own family flourished in the security her marriage had provided them. Her father, freed from the crushing weight of debt that had haunted him for years, had begun making careful improvements to their modest property, small repairs and investments that spoke of renewed hope rather than desperate necessity. Peter and Simon visited Ashcombe Hall often, delighting in the vast grounds and the grey mare that had grown just as fond of their company as she had of Margaret's own. Her mother's garden, once threatened with loss entirely, continued to flourish under her careful attention, a small, steady symbol of everything the family had managed to preserve. Julian, for his part, seemed to soften further with each passing week, the cold reputation that had once defined him throughout the county giving way, slowly but unmistakably, to something warmer and more approachable. He began hosting small gatherings more frequently, no longer content to hide behind the formal distance that had once characterized his interactions with neighboring families. Mr. Whitfield remarked, on more than one occasion, that he had not seen the estate carry such genuine warmth since the days before Julian's parents had passed, a transformation the old steward attributed entirely to Margaret's steady, quiet influence. "You have given him back something he lost long ago," Whitfield told Margaret one afternoon, as she reviewed household accounts alongside him, a task she had taken increasing interest in since her marriage began. "I do not know that he would ever admit it directly, my lady, but I have watched this family long enough to recognize the difference between duty and genuine happiness. His Grace carries the latter now, where once he carried only the former." Margaret treasured such observations, small confirmations of a transformation she witnessed daily in Julian's own quiet gestures, the way he now sought her opinion on estate matters, rather than simply informing her of decisions already made, the way he lingered over breakfast conversations rather than retreating immediately to his study, the way his rare smiles came more easily and more often with each passing month. Their evenings in the library remained a cherished ritual, though poetry had gradually given way to easier conversation, plans for the estate, memories shared from their respective childhoods, quiet laughter over small, ordinary moments that had once seemed impossible between two people who had begun their union as strangers bound by necessity alone. Margaret took on a more active role in the estate's affairs as the months progressed, accompanying Julian on his visits to tenant families, learning the particular concerns of the land and the people who depended upon it for their livelihood. She discovered a genuine talent for such work, a patience and warmth that Julian himself had not always managed to convey in his more formal, reserved dealings with the estate's tenants. Where he offered fair judgment and careful management, Margaret offered something the estate had perhaps lacked for years, a genuine, personal warmth that made tenant families feel seen rather than merely administered. "You have a gift for this that I have never possessed," Julian told her one afternoon, watching her kneel beside an elderly tenant's garden, discussing the woman's ailing roses with the same careful attention she had once given her own mother's garden. "I manage the estate out of duty. You manage it seems, out of genuine care for the people within it." "Perhaps duty and care are not so different as they first appear," Margaret said, rising and brushing soil from her hands. "You have simply expressed yours differently than I express mine." Julian considered this for a long moment, before nodding slowly, something thoughtful settling into his expression. "Perhaps you are right. I had not considered it in those terms before." Such small conversations became the fabric of their growing partnership, each of them learning from the other, each of them softening old habits and assumptions in favor of a shared understanding neither could have built alone. Margaret found herself, more and more, thinking of Ashcombe Hall not as Julian's house that she had married into, but as their home, built jointly from the foundation of trust they had fought so hard to establish. "Do you ever think of that first day?" Margaret asked one evening, curled comfortably in her usual chair by the fire, "when I stood in this very study, terrified and proud, refusing to weep in front of a duke I believed to be entirely without mercy?" "Often," Julian admitted, a faint smile touching his mouth. "I remember thinking, even then, that I had never encountered anyone quite like you. Most who sat in that chair came prepared to grovel, to weep, to offer whatever performance they believed might soften my judgment. You offered me nothing but honesty, delivered with more courage than I had seen from anyone in years. I believe, if I am honest with myself, that I began falling in love with you in that very moment, though it took me a great deal longer to recognize it as such." "You hit it well," Margaret said, laughing softly. "I spent our first weeks together convinced you regarded me as little more than a practical solution to an inconvenient obligation. I regarded you as far more than that, even then, though I lacked the vocabulary to admit it, even to myself," Julian said. "Years of guardedness do not unravel easily, Margaret, however strong the feeling working against them. I am grateful, more than I can properly express, that you had the patience to wait for me to catch up to what my heart had already decided." Margaret rose from her chair and crossed to where he sat, settling beside him, rather than across from him for the first time in their evening ritual, a small shift that felt, somehow, entirely significant. "I did not always feel patient," she admitted. "There were nights I feared this marriage would remain forever what it began as, a transaction dressed in polite formality, nothing more. I am glad, more than I can say, that we proved that fear wrong." Julian reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers with a gentleness that had become entirely natural between them. "We built something neither of us expected, from circumstances neither of us chose," he said. "I do not believe that makes it any less real, Margaret. Perhaps it makes it more so, having survived doubt and interference, and the particular difficulty of learning to trust each other from such an unconventional beginning." They sat together in comfortable silence for a long while after that, the fire crackling steadily beside them, the vast house settling into its usual quiet around them. Margaret thought of the desperate, frightened young woman who had first traveled to Ashcombe Hall to beg for mercy on her family's behalf, and felt a quiet gratitude for the strange, unlikely path that had led her from that difficult morning to this peaceful evening, sitting beside a husband she had genuinely come to love, in a home she had genuinely come to consider her own. The following month, Julian arranged a small celebration, not the formal announcement of their marriage that county tradition might have expected, but something more personal, a gathering of close family and the household staff who had supported them through the difficulties of recent months. Margaret's parents attended, along with Peter and Simon, and even Mr. Whitfield and Alice were invited to join the small circle of celebration, an unconventional gesture that spoke to how thoroughly Julian's understanding of family had expanded beyond the narrow boundaries of title and bloodline. "To second beginnings," Julian said, raising his glass toward Margaret as the small gathering settled into quiet conversation around them, "and to the courage it takes to build something real from circumstances that never promised to deliver it." Margaret raised her own glass in return, meeting his eyes across the small distance between them, warmth and certainty settling comfortably into place where uncertainty and fear had once lived. "To honesty," she said softly, "and to the mercy neither of us expected to find, in each other, when this all began." Her father rose partway through the celebration, raising his own glass with hands that no longer trembled the way they had on that terrible morning when the Duke's letter first arrived at their breakfast table. I have watched my daughter show more courage in the past year than I managed to summon in a lifetime of careful pride, he said, his voice thick with emotion he made no effort to hide. She walked into a stranger's study to save a family that had nearly lost everything, and she has since built something none of us dared hope for, a genuine, happy home. I could not be prouder of the woman she has become, nor more grateful to the man who has come to cherish her as she deserves. Margaret felt tears gather in her own eyes at her father's words, and Julian's hand found hers beneath the table, steady and warm, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had built together since that first difficult meeting in his study. Peter and Simon, grown taller and more confident in the months since their families' fortunes had changed, laughed easily with the household staff, entirely at ease in a house that had once seemed impossibly grand and foreign to their modest upbringing. As the evening drew to its close and guests began departing into the cool night air, Margaret and Julian remained behind in the entrance hall, watching the last of the carriages disappear down the long drive. "Your father is right, you know," Julian said quietly, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as they stood together in the quiet aftermath of the celebration. "You have shown more courage this past year than most people manage across an entire lifetime." "I had good reason," Margaret said, leaning into him. "A family to save, and eventually a marriage worth fighting for." "And what do you fight for now?" Julian asked, "now that both battles have been won?" Margaret considered the question for a long moment, watching the moonlight spread quietly across the grounds she had once found so intimidating and foreign. "Now," she said finally, "I suppose I simply choose to build, not out of desperation or necessity, but because I have found something here worth building carefully, for whatever years still lie ahead of us." Julian pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, and together they turned back toward the warm light spilling from the open doorway of Ashcombe Hall. The house that had once represented nothing but fear and obligation now settled fully into the shape of a genuine, hard-won home. Outside, the grounds of Ashcombe Hall stretched quietly into the gathering evening. The same vast, intimidating landscape that had once seemed so foreign to Margaret now settled comfortably into the shape of home. Whatever difficulties still lay ahead, whatever challenges a life together might yet demand of them, Margaret understood, with a certainty she had not possessed on that first frightened morning, that she and Julian would face them together, as true partners rather than strangers bound by necessity, their marriage finally standing on the solid, honest foundation it had always deserved. A year had passed since the small celebration in the entrance hall of Ashcombe Hall, and the house that had once felt so vast and foreign to Margaret now carried the easy familiarity of a home fully claimed. She moved through its corridors without hesitation, no longer the uncertain young woman who had once lost her way at every fork in the hallway, but the confident, settled mistress of an estate she had come to love as thoroughly as the man who shared it with her. The gardens had flourished under her attention that year, expanded beyond their original borders to include a small section modeled after her mother's own beloved plot, roses and lavender planted in careful rows that reminded her, whenever she walked among them, of the modest home she had nearly lost and the family she had ultimately saved. Her mother visited often now, no longer burdened by the fear and desperation that had once defined every conversation between them, free instead to simply enjoy her daughter's company, and the grandchildren she hoped, with quiet, unspoken patience, might arrive in due time. Margaret sat in that garden one warm afternoon, a letter from Peter spread across her lap, full of enthusiastic news about his recent successes at school, when Alice approached with a soft, knowing smile that suggested some pleasant surprise awaited. "His Grace has asked that you join him in the study, my lady, when you have a moment to spare," Alice said. He seemed rather pleased about something, though he would not say what. Margaret rose, curiosity piqued, and made her way through the familiar corridors toward the study where her marriage had first begun under such uncertain, transactional circumstances. She found Julian standing by the same window where she had first met him, though his posture now carried none of the guarded coldness that had once defined his every gesture. He turned as she entered, a genuine, unguarded smile spreading across his face, one she had grown to treasure more with each passing month of their marriage. "You seem pleased with yourself," Margaret observed, crossing the room to join him. "I have received word from the physician this morning," Julian said, taking both her hands in his own. "Regarding matters we discussed some weeks ago." Margaret's breath caught, understanding immediately what he meant, though she scarcely dared to hope the news might finally be what she had quietly wished for across recent months. "And?" "You are with child, Margaret," Julian said, his voice carrying an emotion she had rarely heard from him, unguarded joy entirely stripped of the careful composure he had once worn like armor against the world. "By spring, we will have a son or daughter of our own." Margaret felt tears gather immediately, though these carried none of the fear or uncertainty that had once accompanied so many of her tears during the difficult early months of their marriage. These were tears of pure, uncomplicated joy, and Julian pulled her gently into his arms, holding her close in the same study where their unconventional union had first begun. "I did not expect," Margaret said, her voice muffled against his shoulder, "when I first walked into this room desperate and afraid, that it would one day become the place where such wonderful news reached me." "Nor did I expect," Julian said, pressing a gentle kiss to the top of her head, "that the frightened, proud young woman who once refused to weep in front of me would become the very center of everything I hold dear." They stood together for a long while, the weight of the news settling comfortably between them, before Margaret finally pulled back enough to study his face, searching for any lingering trace of the guarded, distant man she had first encountered so many months earlier. "Are you frightened?" she asked gently, understanding the particular vulnerability such news might stir in a man who had lost his own parents so young, who had spent years believing affection carried more risk than comfort. "Terrified," Julian admitted, with a rare, unguarded honesty that had become increasingly natural between them over the past year. "I lost my own parents before I had truly learned what it meant to be loved by them fully, and I find myself wondering whether I possess the capacity to offer our child the warmth I never fully received myself." "You possess more warmth than you credit yourself with," Margaret said firmly. "I have watched you these past months, Julian, correcting your steward with patience rather than cruelty, visiting tenant families with genuine care for their well-being, sitting beside me in this very study reading poetry aloud simply because it brought me joy. Whatever coldness once defined you before our marriage, it has long since given way to something far gentler. Our child will know nothing but that gentleness, I am certain of it." Julian studied her for a long moment, something settling more fully into place behind his eyes, the last remnants of old doubt finally releasing their hold entirely. "Then I suppose," he said, "we shall learn to be parents together, the same way we learned to build a genuine marriage from circumstances that never promised to deliver one." Word spread quickly through the household once the news became official, and the following weeks brought a warmth to Ashcombe Hall that Margaret had never witnessed during her earliest days there, a sense of genuine celebration spreading among the staff who had grown fond of their young mistress over the past year. Alice in particular could barely contain her excitement, already planning small preparations for the nursery with an enthusiasm that made Margaret laugh more freely than she had in weeks. Mr. Whitfield, upon hearing the news, sought Margaret out personally, his weathered face carrying an emotion she had rarely seen from the steady, composed steward. "This family has needed new life within these walls for a very long time, my lady," he said. "I confess I did not always believe I would live to see it, given how thoroughly grief had settled over this house before your arrival. You have brought more than happiness to His Grace. You have brought this entire household back to life." Margaret's own family celebrated the news with equal joy, her father embracing her warmly during his next visit, tears gathering in eyes that had wept so differently during that terrible morning when the Duke's letter first threatened to destroy everything they held dear. Peter and Simon, now old enough to understand the significance of the news more fully than they once had, peppered Margaret with eager questions about whether they might visit often once the child arrived, questions she answered with genuine delight, already imagining her brothers as doting uncles within the vast, once lonely halls of Ashcombe Hall. As autumn deepened into winter, and the estate settled into its quieter seasonal rhythms, Margaret found herself reflecting often on the strange, unlikely path that had brought her to this moment of quiet, contented happiness. She thought of that first desperate morning, her father's trembling hands around a cup of cold tea, the letter that had threatened to destroy everything her family held dear. She thought of the carriage ride to Ashcombe Hall, her heart pounding with fear and determination in equal measure, and the cold, guarded Duke who had studied her with such careful, assessing eyes across his wide oak desk. She thought, too, of Beatrice, whose careful scheme had nearly unraveled everything before it had truly begun, and felt, to her own quiet surprise, not lingering anger but something closer to distant pity for a woman who had let jealousy consume whatever genuine affection she might once have carried for her cousin. Margaret had heard, through occasional county gossip, that Beatrice had settled into a quiet, unremarkable life with her distant relations, her ambitions for grandeur permanently curtailed by the scandal that had followed her departure from Ashcombe Hall. But mostly, in these quiet, reflective moments, Margaret thought of Julian, of the poetry he had read to her by firelight during their earliest, most uncertain weeks together, of the gentle patience he had shown tenant families and household staff alike, of the raw, unguarded honesty he had finally offered her once old doubts had been laid entirely to rest. She thought of the man he had become across the year of their marriage, not through any dramatic transformation, but through the slow, patient accumulation of small, honest moments, each one building upon the last until the cold, distant Duke of County rumor had given way entirely to the warm, devoted husband she now shared her life with. On a quiet evening in late winter, as snow gathered softly against the windows of Ashcombe Hall, Margaret sat beside Julian in their beloved library, her hand resting gently against the gentle curve of her growing stomach, his own hand covering hers with careful, protective tenderness. "Whatever this child becomes," Julian said quietly, watching the fire crackle steadily before them, "I hope they inherit your courage above all else. The courage to speak honestly, even when silence would prove easier. The courage to fight for what matters, even against circumstances that seem impossible to overcome." "And I hope," Margaret said softly, leaning into his warmth, "that they inherit your capacity for change, Julian. The willingness to examine old wounds honestly, and to choose warmth over the easier comfort of guarded distance." Julian pressed a gentle kiss to her temple, and together they sat in comfortable silence, watching the snow gather quietly outside their window, two people who had begun their union as strangers bound by desperate necessity, and had built, across a year of careful honesty and hard-won trust, something neither of them had ever expected to find. Later that evening, after Alice had helped Margaret settle into bed, and the household had quieted fully around them, Julian lingered a while longer beside her, watching the gentle rise and fall of her breathing, as sleep began to claim her. He thought, in the quiet privacy of that moment, of his own parents, of the cold, distant marriage that had shaped so much of his early understanding of what a partnership between husband and wife might look like. He had spent years believing himself destined to repeat that same careful, guarded distance, protecting himself from disappointment by refusing to expect warmth in the first place. Margaret had proven him wrong in every possible way. She had walked into his life a stranger, desperate and proud in equal measure, and had somehow, through nothing more than consistent honesty and quiet courage, taught him that warmth need not always end in betrayal, that trust, once carefully rebuilt, could hold firm against whatever storms still threatened to test it. He thought of the child growing steadily within her, of the family they were building together from foundations neither of them had chosen but both had come to genuinely treasure, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could easily remember, a settled, complete sense of peace. A genuine home, a genuine partnership, and now, waiting quietly for spring, a genuine family of their own, born not from mercy alone, but from the deeper, more lasting gift of love that had grown steadily between them since that very first difficult morning, in a cold, guarded study neither of them would ever forget.